Welcome back, and in today's attempt at another hidden gem video where we look at movies from the golden age of filmmaking that may have been overlooked throughout the decades, we are going to look at 1931's Night Nurse, starring Barbara Stanwyck, Ben Lyon, Joan Blondell, and Clark Gable, based on the Grace Perkins novel by the same name. The film revolves around Barbara Stanwyck playing Laura Hart as she rises through the profession of nursing and runs into the dilemma of ethics that comes with the vocation along the way. This film has notoriety for a few reasons, one being the numerous changing scenes Stanwyck and Blondell go through, the other being a clean-shaven Clark Gable playing a villain. Being this film was produced in 1931, it falls into the pre-code era of Hollywood. Most of the time these films would range around an hour or an hour and 10 minutes, with a quick pace hitting scenes as if they were bullet points. For those unaware, pre-code was exactly what it sounds like. Even though the code was put in place in 1930, it would not be until mid-1934 that it was heavily enforced. Night Nurse specifically has scenes that a few years later to be considered provocative, scandalous, and violent, while the heavy alcohol consumption wouldn't meet the code as well. So let's take a look at Night Nurse. Spoiler warning, I will only recap until we get to the climax of the picture before getting to the review aspect of the video. So if you want to watch the movie first before viewing the video, or if you want to just dive on in, the choice, as it will always be, is up to you. We start with the title of the movie and the credits before we are thrown into an ambulance about to crash in a pretty impressive shot for the early 30s. Luckily, this isn't the driver's first rodeo, and we arrive to the hospital avoiding pedestrians. They unload the victim of a car crash as we follow them in before we tag off to a nervous soon-to-be father hoping for a boy. We see a screen around a dying man, a family of 5 arguing, and that's when we enter the office where Laura Hart is applying for a job in nursing. The superintendent of nurses, Miss Dillon, is a little sharp with her, finding that she does not have a high school diploma, and her only recommendation coming from a grocer.
He's a grocer.
A grocer?
She dropped out in 11th grade when her mother passed away. Hart tries to make a deal of completing night classes, but Miss Dillon is hearing none of that and dismisses her. On her way out, Laura is rudely spun out of the revolving door by a gentleman. He comes back to pick up her items as they begin to warm up to one another, and he takes Laura back to Miss Dillon. Turns out this man is no gentleman. He is the hospital's chief of staff, Dr. Bell. Miss Dillon changes her tune like Eddie Haskell, and the doc says they will call the high school to get the rest of the classes waived. The doc leaves as Miss Dillon runs down some of the rules and regulations. Joan Blondell, playing Miss Maloney, enters the office and is assigned to help her select a uniform and says hello to her new roommate. On the way, they pass some young men on the staff who flip for Laura a coin as well, and we are introduced to Egan. In the changing area, we learn that Maloney is fed up with his job but stays here because it's the only work she knows. She picks out a uniform for Laura, who informs her that she's broke. Maloney tells her about what Dr. Bell's position is at the hospital. She finds one that fits and informs her it's fine. They change in there, and in pre-code fashion, Laura does so before being interrupted by Egan, who says he just came from the delivery room.
Oh, don't be embarrassed. You can't show me a thing. I just came from the delivery room.
What are you doing here, baby frightener?
He welcomes Laura to the hospital before going back and forth with Maloney. When Laura takes her side, Egan takes a hint and exits. Maloney continues with advice: stay away from interns and doctors, look for a rich patient, that's the ticket. We cut to the final result of the changing before we enter the maternity ward with Laura and Maloney. We get an early 30s educational look as how that goes, and Laura delivers the babies to their proper mother as she takes in her work for that day. We then fast forward to one night when Laura and Maloney have broken curfew. They debate how to approach not getting caught before we get one of the famous undressing scenes. The two try to sneak around until no one as Miss Dillon probably heard this, and the coincidental knocking. Maloney convinces Laura to jump into bed with the skeleton. Unfortunately for us, this person at the door is Egan. He takes off, and this awakens Miss Dillon. The two figure it's Egan again at the door, so Maloney lets her have it, slipper style. Miss Dillon questions who threw the footwear, but Maloney plays ignorant, and Laura gets the punishment before she can lie. Miss Dillon moseys to Maloney to take the sheet off her, seeing that they both just got back. She is delivered the same night shift punishment as her roomie. As the warden leaves, Laura hops into Maloney's bed, frightened of the skeleton, and the two end this adventure. Our next story takes us to the emergency ward as our two leading ladies are helping a doctor with a patient who's injured his head. Ready to take the injured to jail, Laura makes a suggestion for him to stay overnight. As he is escorted to the prison ward, we are introduced to Ben Lyon's character, Morty. He wants some bandages and iodine for a friend, but Laura sees through him, knowing that he's the one who's actually injured. She also can tell he's a bootlegger when examining the flesh wound. He objects to her cutting his silk shirt.
Say, that's silk.
That's how I know you're a bootlegger.
Turns out to be a bullet wound. He pleads for her not to make a police report on it. He explains he was shot by someone who didn't agree with his business decision to not buy alcohol from him. They have the ethics debate on each other's profession. As Maloney returns to see the wound, wanting to make out a report, Laura tells her they aren't going to and says this is a friend of hers. Morty is impressed with her taking a huge risk, but not so much with her salary. As the intern comes back in, they play it off as Morty is discharged. The intern makes a friendly reminder to Maloney to clean the bedpan as our chapter ends. We move on to surgery, where Maloney is trying to hype up a nervous Laura who's never dealt with such a major operation before. Before entering, a nurse remembers someone left a package for Laura. She opens it up and it turns out to be a bottle of rye and a nice note from her bootlegger pal. We then join in on the surgery, where we learn Doc Bell's performing a dangerous procedure. Everything's going fine until the patient stops breathing. A tank of H2O is brought over, but it's too late. Seeing Laura heading to Faint City, Maloney steps up to save her. Everyone but them two leave. Laura asks if this happens often, which Maloney says no, but when it does, it's bad news, and Laura faints as our scene ends. Our next step is graduation, where the nurses recite the Florence Nightingale Pledge. One seems more enthusiastic about this than the other. Laura also gets another gift from bootlegger Morty that may be a tad bit bigger than the other nurses' gifts. After graduation, much like real life, everything gets more difficult, as we see Laura has been assigned as a night nurse. Laura enters the home of the Ritchie family, where she is trading off shifts with Maloney, who got her this assignment. They try to figure out why Dr. Bell was replaced on this case with Dr. Ranger. While we get another undressing scene, Maloney runs down the sketchiness behind all of this, as the children, Nanny and Destiny, are doing worse since they got back from the hospital. Laura calls her crazy before Maloney runs down the layout for her and warns her about the housekeeper before exiting. We introduce to the children, who are jumping on the bed, and like that one story, one falls off. While showing their admiration for our lead, we learn that there was a third sister named Laura who was ran over and killed. They both give us our first mention of Nick. Unlike their deceased father, he isn't a nice guy. So much so, Nanny begins crying at the thought of him. Destiny tells Laura they didn't want to come home, both pretty frightened, and their mother won't come see them anymore. About that time, Miss Maxwell, the housekeeper, scolds them for being up. In the other room, Maxwell, the battle axe, lets Laura know that children have had nightmares since returning home, and not to take them too serious. Laura can see, and we speed up to later in the shift, when she is asleep and awoken by a scream. She's met by a drunk at the door who says a lady needs her assistance. Laura finds a woman passed out and turns out to be the children's mother. She tries to get the drunk partygoer to leave so that she can undress the mom, but he's the type to stay. He starts trying to get fresh with Laura, and she fights off the initial advance before he continues dragging her to the floor, before we finally get a look at Clark Gable, appeared as Nick the chauffeur. He takes care of the offender, but before we can jump on the Nick wagon, he gets sharp with Laura, telling her not to call a doctor and to fix Miss Ritchie herself. He gets rough with her, and she tries calling a doctor behind his back, which makes matters worse. He introduces himself.
Who are you?
I'm Nick, the chauffeur.
Sending Laura back. Still, she tries once more to phone and gets socked for trouble. He takes her back to the couch near the children's bedroom as she awakes and thinks twice as she sees him in the hallway. She turns around so that we can see the extent of her injury. The next day, we join Laura in Dr. Ranger's office, the doc who replaced Dr. Bell in the case. He doesn't believe her and says they won't fall for blackmail. He tries every excuse he can think of, especially when she challenges his feeding instructions. She resigns, and he promises her license will be revoked if she does. She goes to find someone who will listen as Dr. Ranger gets a hold of Nick as we transition to Laura in Dr. Bell's office, where she pleads her case to him. He won't intervene in the case because it's another doctor's assignment, saying ethics triggering Laura.
It's about as unethical
Oh, ethics, ethics, ethics. That's all I've heard since I've been in this business. Isn't there any humanity in it?
He talks her into going back on the assignment to find evidence as they debate the options they can take, as he's starting to see her point. She goes and makes up with Dr. Ranger, who falls for it hook, line, and sinker. She visits Miss Ritchie, who pays Laura $100 for what she had to go through the other night. This impresses Maloney, who could use the money. We transition to Laura at the pharmacist, where she runs into our bootlegger pal Morty again. He gives her an update on his hand, and he asks what happened to her chin. He wants to get even, but she doesn't want him to get in a jam over her. Finding out she was available during the day, he wants to go on a date. Saying he has given up the racket, but this notion has ended quickly from an untimely entrance by a colleague. We go to another night of carousing, as Nanny isn't doing too hot. Maxwell is starting to actually worry for once, and Maloney is mad that Laura is late. They get in a debate about a milk bath if it would be effective for the young child, as Laura arrives blowing the lid on the Maloney and Egan romance, as he is downstairs waiting for her. Laura shows off the gift she got for Nanny, as Maloney informs her that she is getting worse. Maloney leaves Laura wishing her luck as she checks on Nanny and sees that she is dying. That's where we'll stop on the recap for spoiler reasons, as we usually do with Hidden Gems, and transition into the review portion. We get a lot in this picture for a movie that has a little more than a 70-minute runtime. In pre-code era films, this was generally the time frame that the movie would last, meaning some elements were cut for time. In this case, they cram everything needed into the story, just as much as if it was 20 minutes longer. We get the origins of Laura getting the nursing job, rising up the ranks in her field, introducing us to necessary characters throughout, and ending with the main plot, keeping the focus mainly character-wise on Laura Maloney. The one item they maybe could have added a little to was the romance of Laura and Morty, but his absence is explained well enough to make sense story-wise. The flow of this film, as well as the pace, is another component I enjoy. The structure of the film works well with the subject matter. The transition of each step in Laura's career is a nice, quick way to keep us in the loop of her progression, giving us one tale from each step and usually fitting into the plot in some way, shape, or form. It also gives us a peek into nursing during the Great Depression. As it is Hollywood, there's probably some of the details that are exaggerated for dramatic effect. One that is accurate is when Laura and Maloney are assigned to the dying children. It was typical for a nurse to be assigned one case at a time during this era upon graduating, as in the film. Before the Great Depression, most nurses sought private casework only, but after the crash of the market, the nurse setting changed to that of the hospital. Most people could no longer afford that kind of care, which makes sense in the movie why the children come from a wealthy home. The lack of private cases resulted in the number of hours being cut back at the hospital from 12 to 8 a day, so that more nurses could be hired. At the beginning of the film, Dr. Bell was so lenient in getting Laura signed up despite missing high school courses. More than likely, this was because the profession was looking for any help in case someone didn't work out, as the pay was as bad as Laura states to the bootlegger. Some hospitals didn't even have enough cash to pay the nurses, which also plays into why Laura's heart is more about the actual work as the incentive instead of the money. As this was based on a book, it had to be adapted, and the assignment went to Oliver H.P. Garrett, with Charles Kenyon providing extra dialogue. As there are a few differences from the source material that I may cover in another video, there were a few changes that had to be developed, mostly coming from the climax and the ending. Garrett won an Oscar for writing with Joseph Mankiewicz for Manhattan Melodrama in 1934. He also worked on the Gone with the Wind script as well in an uncredited role. Directing-wise, William H. Wellman was in charge of Night Nurse, and by this time he had already made some notable pictures. Wings and The Public Enemy, with the former being the first Best Picture winner. So it's no surprise why Night Nurse looks so crisp and stylistic as it does. It seems well advanced in that area for its time. The opening POV shot alone was something of a rarity in that era, let alone that well done. Wellman originally was discovered while playing hockey by Douglas Fairbanks, who thought he would make a good actor. Finding he despised the profession, he showed interest in directing, so Fairbanks got him on as a messenger at Goldwyn, where he worked his way up. After Night Nurse, he would make successful, notable pictures, including The Oxbow Incident, The Story of G.I. Joe, The High and the Mighty, and the original A Star is Born. As far as acting goes, and especially early 30s, this is one of the stronger entries and one of the main reasons I enjoy this film. We get a very young Barbara Stanwyck playing Nurse Laura Hart as probably the toughest nurse you'll ever see in a film.
You mother.
It's hard to tell that she had only been in Hollywood for a couple of years, as she gives a very polished performance. One scene she can be getting tough with an uncaring mother, and the next making jokes with a bootlegger. Joan Blondell is also good as a roommate/friend, as with her busy career in the 1930s, she would bounce around as either the leading lady or usually the role she has here as the witty, smart-aleck best friend, in a career that spanned almost half a century. With Clark Gable, he's playing against type here as the villain and without a mustache, which shows you where he was at in his career. Originally slated to be played by James Cagney, but the studio felt this was too small of a part for the star once The Public Enemy became a hit. For Gable, though, not too long after this film, he would start to climb the ladder to stardom and become the king of Hollywood, as the following year he would star in Red Dust with Jean Harlow. And 3 years after Night Nurse, he would star opposite Claudette Colbert in It Happened One Night and win his only Oscar. Ben Lyon plays the bootlegger in this tale, and for a sign of the times, he was actually the protagonist. Lyon was a very successful screen star in the silent era as a leading man. His most notable credit was the 1930s Howard Hughes film,
Hell's Angels.
a movie mostly known for the stunts. Lyon was a trained flyer from his World War I days, so he filmed some of the airborne scenes for Hughes himself. This same year is when he married B.B. Daniels, who the two would stay together until her passing. When both stars' appeal started waning, the two formed a husband and wife act, taking it to England, where it was a huge hit, as well as their radio show Adventures on BBC Radio, one titled High Gang and the other being Life with the Lions, the latter sparking two films and a sitcom that starred their children as well. Lyon would also host the British version of the game show I've Got a Secret, and a few years before his passing, he was made a member of the Order of the British Empire. One last tidbit on Ben Lyon. As he moved back to America in between stints, he worked as a casting director for Fox, where he discovered a little-known actress named Norma Jean Mortensen, or later known as Marilyn Monroe. Edward J. Nugent plays Egan, and this was the type of role he would usually perform in his 12-year acting career. He even had a few TV directing credits to his name upon retiring. He ran a knick-knack shop in Tinseltown. Blanche Frederici plays the Ritchie's housekeeper, who only got into acting as her eyes began to fail her and she couldn't teach anymore. She appeared in 60 films, her final one being posthumous, and It Happened One Night. Charles Winninger portrays Dr. Bell. He was discovered on Broadway, originating Captain Andy in Showboat. He had eventually starred in the theatrical version as well, on a way to a successful career, and most people know him from his role as Fred Mertz's former vaudeville partner Barney Kurtz on I Love Lucy. Lastly, an unnamed intern was played by Alan Lane, who would go on to have success later in his career as the voice of Mr. Ed.
Hello, I'm Mr. Ed.
In conclusion, I feel this is a great film to start with if you're wanting to jump into the pre-code era. It's one of the best acted, directed, and overall stories to start with. It also has all the examples of a film made in this time frame that fans of the pre-code love. Also, getting to see both Stanwyck and Gable in early roles is a treat, and easy to understand why they both have successful careers after this. It was also fun seeing Stanwyck and Blondell together in a film, as the two play off one another really well, and it's unfortunate this was their final pairing on the big screen. And if you're into history, this acts as a nice time capsule of what the profession of nursing looked like in a desperate point in U.S. history. And if this is enough to hook you, the curiosity of seeing a film where a chauffeur is starving children to death in the early 30s, and the only ones who can stop him is a no-nonsense nurse and her bootlegger boyfriend might be. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully you too enjoy this picture. Until next time, I'm the Golden Age Reviewer. Remember to throw it back, way, way back.
Funny what people think money will do, isn't it?
Yeah, keeping our nose out of patients' private affairs is part of our professional ethics.
I'll kill the next one that says ethics to me.
Says you.
Yeah, says me in a big way, sister.